Hi, scholars. I'm going to be reading this story aloud and making inferences by gathering clues as I read. Listen carefully as I model how we gather clues as we read a longer text. Frank dragged himself down the street. He couldn't wait to get all the way home. It had been the worst day of his life. As he walked, the people walking in the other direction gave him funny looks. He considered this and realized he must look pretty strange. His face was covered in soot and his clothes were singed, with little holes burned and tattered around the edges. He'd even lost one of his shoes. A question you might ask yourself right now: what clues can I gather about Frank? What can I gather about my main character? Well, it says he dragged himself down the street. That tells me that he must be feeling tired or sad or disappointed, something like that, because he's dragging himself down the street. It had been the worst day of his life. Wow, so he must be feeling pretty sad. As he walked, the people walking in the other direction gave him funny looks. His face was covered in soot. That's like ashes from a fire. His clothes were singed. He must have gotten burned by something. Oh yeah, it says little holes are burned. And he lost his shoe. So what I know about Frank is that he's had a really bad day. He's feeling pretty sad. And he's obviously been burned by something. So I'm going to keep that in mind as I keep reading. It had started out like an ordinary day. If only he'd taken his normal route to work. Why did he have to walk by the toothpick factory today of all days? That was the last time he'd ever go down Burnham Street. He wouldn't take that risk ever again. So it started out normal. So what that tells me is that weird things started happening after he left his house. It says if only he had taken his normal route to work. That tells me that he changed some things up, right? He took a different route to work. And I feel like this toothpick factory must be important if it's something that he doesn't normally see. So those are the clues that I gathered about Frank's day in paragraph 2. As he walked past the Shanahan's house, he could hear the TV blasting with the nightly news. Well, Ted, it was all thanks to one local man. The flames, I remember he got burned. The flames were barely starting to creep through the windows when he arrived like Superman. Do you guys think that Frank could be who they're talking about? Unfortunately, he didn't stay long enough to give his name. All we have is an item of clothing he left behind. Oh man, remember he said he lost a shoe? Probably as he climbed out the window after saving the building from ruin. Bingo. Here is what I know about Frank's day now. That must be Frank. I infer that Frank is the man that the news anchors are talking about because there was a fire and they're talking about an item of clothing left behind, and we know that Frank left a shoe behind at the scene where he got burned. So I'm putting together the clues, and I think that Frank was there. And this says he saved the building from ruin. So Frank must be some kind of hero. Back to you at the studio, Ted. The Shanahans began discussing the program. Wow, did you hear that? Right here in our own neighborhood. Frank rolled his eyes and realized he'd never called his boss at work to explain why he didn't come in this morning. He hoped his boss would forgive him once he found out what a day he'd had. Climbing the steps in front of his house, he warily, that means he's tired, turned the doorknob and opened the door. He called to his wife, "Sarah, you'll never believe what happened to me today." What do you think happened to Frank? Well, Given all the clues I have here, and using my own schema or my own knowledge about what happens when someone gets burned by a fire or their clothes get burned, and given that he's tired, I think you'd probably be really tired after saving an entire building from burning down. I'm thinking that Frank is the man that they were talking about on the news, and that on his way to work this morning, he decided to take a different route. And it just so happened that the toothpick factory caught on fire, and he witnessed it. And since no one else was around, he must have had to go in and put out the fire and save the toothpick factory from burning down. It sounds like he worked really hard at that and never even made it to work. And it sounds like he was so exhausted by the end of it and frustrated that he had had such a crazy day that he just turned around and went back home. So, as you can see, while I was reading, I collected clues and I kind of used common sense. I used what I know and I made inferences, made predictions, put the clues together, and I figured out what happened. What if I had stopped collecting clues just after the first paragraph? I wouldn't know about the toothpick factory. I wouldn't have the context of the news reporters. So you've got to make sure when you're reading a longer text, you're collecting clues as you go. Making sure that you're remembering key details. One way to do that is to use a highlighter or use a pencil and paper to jot down clues. You can see here I underlined. And this way I can go back and check my clues and say, does my inference make sense? Does it make sense that I think that Frank saved the building from burning down and that's why he's so tired and that's why his day has been so crazy? Yeah, it does make sense. And I can back that up by referring to the clues I found in the text and saying, well, even though the text doesn't say Frank saved the building, I know enough to put my clues together and I can conclude that that's what happened.